Okay, welcome everybody. I am Katherine Fertig, and I am from Hope Village Recovery Center, and we are a trauma-focused substance abuse treatment center. And I am here today with Dr. Jamie Marich to discuss her book, Trauma in the 12 Steps. But she has a new revised version coming out, and there it is.
Yes.
So I would like to discuss that with you. Let me do a little bit of background real quick. Dr. Marich is an expressive arts therapist. She's a yoga instructor. She's an EMDR therapist, clinical guru of all trauma items. And I have been the privilege of been through several of your trainings, and I know it has affected my total practice, my recovery, etc. So I'm glad to be here with you today, and I would just like to hear a little bit about your background first.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me on today. And I have to say, Catherine, it's been my privilege to have you at my trainings because from the first time I met you during EMDR training, you struck me as a person who just wanted as much as you could about how to help people, especially people in recovery, in a more trauma-focused way. So I would say that part of what drives my work is that as a person in personal recovery, long-term recovery, I was shown recovery from addiction, from trauma, by a woman named Janet, who is no longer with us, in a very trauma informed way. And I like to say that Janet was both trauma informed and trauma focused before it was cool, before the fields were even talking about it that much. And don't get me wrong, I'm glad it's becoming cool and in more fashion and more awareness around being trauma informed, because I don't think I ever would have stayed in a recovery program or in a recovery lifestyle if I wasn't shown the ways of recovery by somebody who was fundamentally, somebody who got trauma. So I got into this field completely through the back door. My undergraduate degree is actually in history and American studies, which means I basically have a pop culture degree. I did not like psychology when I was an undergrad. I took like one or two courses as part of the American studies curriculum and just hated it. And if you would have told me at 19, 18 that I would have been doing this for a living, I probably would have laughed in your face. So I ended up finishing my undergrad, and I was in a really bad way with my own addiction issues, which were, of course, trauma related. And I had a situation where I couldn't really get the help that I needed here because I had one parent who was hell-bent on this was just a sin problem and I had to go back to church. And I had another parent who really took the attitude of, you're too smart for all of this. Or there was a lot of permissiveness offered for drinking as long as I didn't do drugs. And I was just in a very bad way, however you sliced it. So I did what most rational people do, and I geographical cured it at the time. I ran away to Europe, as the story goes, but I really end up conceptualizing it now as a move because I don't think geographic moves are necessarily bad if you do the work when you get there, if you realize that the move itself isn't going to do it. But so in my case, packing up a backpack, taking a little bit of the savings I had and going to Eastern Europe in 2000 was exactly what I needed to meet Janet. So part of why I chose that part of the world is my family's of Croatian background, and I grew up with a lot of connection to the countries in the former Yugoslavia that were affected by the civil war there in the early 90s. And I went there, quite frankly, because I didn't know what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And I was in such a bad way personally. I was not in a position to make any decisions. And I ended up working for the Catholic Church and being involved in several aid projects. And that is how I met Janet. And the cool thing about Janet is she is actually from Chagrin Falls, Ohio. She worked at Rosary Hall in Cleveland.
I don't think I knew that one.
Had a very traditional 12-step background about her. And here she was from less than an hour away from where I'm from in Ohio, because I was raised in Youngstown. And here we met in Bosnia. So Janet was a social worker and was involved with several aid missions during the war and ended up moving to the Croatian part of Bosnia in her retirement to get some treatment started treatment, and she brought some meetings to the area where I was living in. And my first exposure to anything recovery related was to translate a meeting for her. It was not a 12-step meeting, it was like a county council on alcoholism type of meeting. And I was not a professional translator, but I was good in a pinch, and she needed me that day. And when I went to the meeting with her, a lot of what was talking about was just making sense, or what was being discussed was making sense. And so after the meeting, she was just very open-minded and open-hearted to answering my questions. And she ended up giving me a 12-step, an AA big book in Croatian, kind of under the, here, learn some of the words. And I just knew she was just the very spirit of attraction rather than promotion. She didn't try to shove anything down my throat or get me to admit or whatever. She was just a very friendly, good person. So a month later, when I was really struggling with something chemically related, I knew I was able to go to her. And then that's where my addiction recovery essentially started. And all the while, it was trauma informed. One of the foundational lines in those early conversations we had was after I shared with her a little bit of my story and my background, and which involves several different kinds of trauma. She said, Jamie, after everything you've been through, it's no wonder you became addicted. What are you going to do about it now? And that really defines my work, that it's a combination between validating people and their experiences first, but then offering them a challenge into action. Because I think sometimes as trauma-focused professionals, we can almost get too hung up on the trauma, and we end up just giving people a bunch of reasons why they do the things they do, but don't necessarily empower them with proactive solutions to do anything about it. And Janet was just a master at being able to validate and then challenge. And she really helped me understand that so much of what I experienced was trauma related. And I mean, the rest is history, really. It was those seeds that were planted in 2001 that eventually helped me to get on this path of long-term recovery. I've been continuously sober since 2002. And then when I had about a year of recovery, she sent me kicking and screaming to graduate school. And I protested saying, I don't like psychology. And she said, no, give it another chance. I think you'll be good at it based on what you've experienced. And so in my early days of recovery, working in a clinical counseling program, that's also when I found EMDR therapy and realized that I would need to do some more trauma-focused interventions if I was going to stay sober and well, and also if I was going to thrive in this field. So anything I do professionally, it's just an extension of things that were brought to me personally. And my professional work is largely defined by that statement or that sentiment of being able to pay it forward.
And I think that's why so many people are attracted to you, because it's
Mm.
genuine, it's real, it's coming from experience, it's not coming from a book that you learned from, and this is your experience and you're just sharing it. And I think that's very attractive. I think it's funny that you brought up that comment about Janet asking you about action, because that was actually one of the things that I had really gotten out of your book, was because self-pity is a very quick thing to sit in for me. And it's that action. Now what? Okay.
Yeah.
It's been rough. Now what?
And Janet was originally from Kentucky, even though she lived most of her life in Ohio. So she had a bit of a leftover drawl to her. And I could still hear her say, chapter 6 of the big book is called Into Action, not Into Thinking. And she was very much an action-based type of sponsor. And that didn't mean that she didn't validate, because she was wonderful about sitting and listening and telling me and others that you're allowed to feel what you feel. And then after we kind of got that out, it's, so what now? What's the plan?
And I think that's the combination. We talk about fusion all the time, right? And the fusion of trauma therapy with the 12-step program. It's we need to validate, we need to understand where people are coming from, and then what are we going to do next? And that's awesome. Also, so speaking of 12-step programs, I mean, how do you see them as still relevant? I know a lot of people, well, at Hope Village, we don't insist on people going to meetings. We don't insist on people engaging in the recovery community, though we do recommend it, promote it. But it's a matter of finding something that works for you, whether it's smart recovery, whether it's there's a running to be well group, there's yoga and meditation, and there's other
I think
things
the key,
besides 12 step. But why is that so important?
sure, I think the key is whatever is going to help you develop meaningful lifestyle change. That's the imperative. Uh, when I was in, I believe it was when I was working on my doctorate, I became fascinated with this whole 12 step, anti 12 step debate that was out there, because maybe because the 12 steps is what was introduced to me and it helped me so much. I've always had an affinity for 12 step, but then I realized, wow, there's people who are really kind of haters on the 12 steps. And I realized that there were a lot more alternatives out there. And when I was in this program, I became fascinated with looking at all of them. Like, what are the mechanisms of action? What seems to make them work? Why do they work for some and not for others? And in doing that investigation, the big common denominator I was able to ascertain was lifestyle change. That you can have something like AA and something that hates AA, like rational recovery. And the thing that they have in common is they're trying to help people impart healthier lifestyle patterns. And that makes total sense to me. And I could geek out about this. This is my cat, Misty, joining us for some of the interview. She's always making an appearance. That's why she's my cat, right? So I think that's the key. What is helping people to stay accountable? Because I do think accountability is very important on whatever path you're working on, and what is helping you to work on developing a different lifestyle. And I could geek out about that. I did in my doctoral dissertation how Alfred Adler was actually the father of the field that coined the term lifestyle, and this was in the 1920s. And he defined lifestyle as the series of patterns we develop to respond to our own internal sense of inferiority.
Oh, wow.
And there's a very, big trauma link there, of course. And so the metaphor he uses is the idea of glasses, that our lifestyle patterns are essentially the glasses through which we see the world. And if we want to impart in meaningful change, we need to get a new prescription on our glasses. And sometimes we need a new pair of glasses altogether. So for me, whatever is going to help you look through clearer glasses, do it.
One of my favorite quotes, and I don't know who it's from, is it's not that your feelings are wrong. Feelings are based on what your perspective is, and maybe your perspective needs to change.
Yeah. It's a good way to look at it.
So, I mean, I've always been a proponent of 12-step program also. And when I was going through my graduate program, I found it fascinating because I started like everything that they encouraged us to teach clients and how to approach therapy. I compared it to the 12 steps. And I think it's funny that we have all this scientific proof, like, mindfulness is our big thing, right? And meditation. And I don't know if you realize that, but today is
Founders Day.
Founders Day, the birthday of AA. And they knew that it was important for people to pray and meditate every day. And now we have the scientific proof that that really does change the brain and help the brain. And
Right.
I just loved how it was like, they figured this stuff out. They just didn't know why it worked, but it did work.
And I think that there's an important point to look at there, that because I'm a big both and person. Obviously, the 12 steps, AA specifically, has its problems, but I have never thought that means we have to like throw it away.
Right.
And even what you're saying there is an example of both and. Something about it they knew worked. Now we know a little bit more about the mechanisms of AA that do work. But the and side of that is that we have learned a lot more about trauma since 1935. And the key is we can still work with a lot of 12-step principles. They can still be of service to people on a recovery path. but we know a lot more now about how the brain works, how to treat people, how to engage people more effectively, where I think if any 12-stepper, whether they're a sponsor, a person who's working a path, a counselor who might be a 12-step proponent, if you can learn just some of the basic fundamentals about trauma, uh, we can actually intensify the power of what the 12 steps are able to do in terms of helping people engage in this lifestyle change.
Yep, absolutely, I agree. So with this book, with the new edition, what's changed in the book? How is it going to help us?
So what's changed? So the new edition, out July 7th, 2020, although I was happily surprised when I got home yesterday, I had a box of them waiting for me. So obviously they're printed, they just haven't been released. So the original edition came out in 2012. So obviously there's 8 additional years of research and practice knowledge that I've been able to incorporate. And I've also been able to incorporate a lot of the feedback I received from readers on the first edition about what they particularly found helpful. And so I bolstered some of those elements within this new edition. I think what I'm most proud of, though, are the 2 new chapters that I've added. The original edition had 10 chapters, this has 12 chapters. And the new chapters cover, for lack of a better grouping term, diversity issues as a trauma-informed, trauma-focused issue. So for instance, we talk about how being more welcoming and embracing of LGBTQ folks, be more welcoming and embracing of people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds other than kind of the white Anglo-Saxon norm that constituted the program as founders and the beginning founders, and how, yes, this program is beautiful and can reach a lot of people of differing backgrounds, but we also have to know how to treat people in order for this magic of recovery to even have an impact. So clearly with what's going on in the world right now, I hope everybody who's in a 12-step program can have access to read that chapter, because I really engage in some serious calls to action that we're not doing well enough in that area. I don't believe we are, either as treatment centers as a whole or 12-step community meetings, that we really do have to do better with hearing and respecting different voices and different perspectives. And then chapter 12 really continues with that same message of inclusion by looking at spiritual diversity as a trauma-informed, trauma-focused issue. And something I even do there is call for better treatment of people who identify as atheist or agnostic. The first edition of the book drew me a lot of fans from people who are part of the atheists and agnostics in AA community. Their site, AA Agnostica, is pretty extensive. They do their own conference. They even have some of their own literature, because they have found overall being very shunned in mainstream AA, where, yeah, I know we say higher power, but in many parts of the country and in many communities and meetings, it's still God, 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 and the implication is a very Judeo-Christian God. And so I also talk about how many people need to embrace Eastern practices like meditation, like yoga, in order to find that meditative connection or find that sense of God as I understand him. And I also talk in this chapter about the reality of something that's called spiritual abuse, which, you know, my feelings on this, we don't chat about it enough, as a legitimate form of abuse that is connected to trauma. And my general definition of spiritual abuse is whenever God or any spiritual concept has been used as the weapon to control people, especially younger children growing up in religious context, especially if they're identifying as different, if they identify as different sexually, gender expression wise. Maybe they're kids like me who know that, wait, there's a bigger spiritual buffet for me to explore out there, but a very kind of narrow version of a Christian God had been used abusively. So I give some background on spiritual abuse in that chapter to let sponsors and counselors know why people might even struggle with God as I understand him for them. That we have to be embracing. And something about the Eastern practices is it can offer a lot of individuals a path for spiritual connection without the trauma triggers that Christianity might come with.
Yes, I've heard that a great deal from clients.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's what I like about Hope Village, is that we emphasize that, you
Good.
know, and yeah, gender biases aren't here, you know, and you have been doing wonderful work about what's going on in the world. And that's awesome. So those 2 added chapters,
Mhm.
they are written both for clinical and for people
Yes.
in the 12-step
Mhm.
programs.
From the beginning, the trauma and the 12 steps work has been written for clinicians and non-clinicians. I would say my target audience initially were clinical professionals and sponsors, or anybody who's in a position to guide another person in recovery. And I since have
Okay.
found out that many people who are not necessarily sponsor or a clinician have found the book useful because it does validate the experience of trauma. But I ideally want anybody who is guiding others in recovery to be able to pick this book up, because just having a little bit of trauma knowledge can help you go a long, long, long way in making sure people may not get alienated from this path. At very least, do no harm is the very least, but hopefully at the very best, we can help people be more proactive in how they're addressing recovery issues.
Excellent. Yeah, we just added this to the library. We have a trauma recovery pod at Portage County Jail, and we just
Mm,
added this to the library for
thank
the
you.
girls to
Nice.
read. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Marich, for popping in and talking to me today. I am looking forward to that book showing up at my doorstep.
Wonderful. My great pleasure. And thank you for all the work that you're doing, Katherine.
Absolutely. Thank you.